All right, when we last left off in the book of Judges, we read about how Gideon was called to go and fight against the Midianites. The Midianites were raiders. And they came up every year during the harvest season, to steal Israel's food. And when they came, they were compared to locusts because they stripped the land bare. And they were innumerable. So it was just this cloud of people who came, and they took everything that they found. And when they set up for the newest raid, they didn't know that God had called this man Gideon to go and fight against them to deliver Israel. And the way he did it first was he sent messengers all throughout the land, and he drummed up an army. And he got 32,000 men to respond. And they were ready to fight. They had this army for the first time in a while. But God knew that that was just going to be something they could boast about. So he fixed that. First he dropped them down. He said everybody who's afraid can leave. And that dropped them down to 10,000. So more than 2/3 of their army left. And then he said, well, even this is too many. And so he dropped it down to 300. And so they just had very few people left to fight. These 300 men went to the Midianite camp at night. They sort of surrounded them. Of course, it wasn't a very good surrounding, just 300 men trying to circle more than 100,000 people. And their strategy was they were going to blow trumpets and smash these jars and shout a sword for the Lord and for Gideon, and they hold up a torch. And so there's sounds and there's sights coming from all around. And it didn't sound like a great plan, but it actually was, because it was God's plan. He would fight for his people. And what happened was, when everything started making all this noise, and then there was this light, the army panicked. And the credit goes to God. He didn't swipe his own sword, but he made every person turn against every other person. They come out of their tents and they're just afraid, and here comes somebody running at me, and they start hacking at each other. And after not too long, there wasn't very many left, and they all started to flee. There was no army left. They were just people trying to get away from the battlefield. And the Israelites chased them down and cut down a bunch more. And then when they began to run, Gideon sent out more messengers to the Ephraimites. Now, I sent you a map, and it's on our New Grace Facebook message. That map is real helpful just to get a better picture of this battle. So if you want to pull that open, you can see what I'm talking about, and you can kind of see where they were going. You see the battle was fought, we'll say, up here, and everybody was sort of escaping, going south and east. So you got your Ephraimites down here to the south, and so Gideon sends some messengers, and he says, hey, cut them off. Don't let them get across the Jordan and get away from us. And so they did. They went and they chased down some of the people, some of the leaders, and when they caught them, they killed them and brought their heads back to Gideon. And that was where we left off last time. Well, when they did that, when they showed up with the heads, they weren't happy with Gideon. That's where we're going to start now. Judges chapter 8, verse 1. Then the men of Ephraim said to him, what is this you've done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian? And they accused him fiercely. So the Ephraimites, also Israelites, they were angry because they hadn't been asked earlier to come in and join the fight. And it might seem kind of petty to us. And actually, most of us would probably be relieved, wouldn't we, to know that we didn't get invited to go fight this battle. And who would want to fight if you don't have to fight? But they took it as a snub. They weren't happy about it at all. And if you think about it, when Gideon was originally asked if he would come or if he was commanded to go and lead Israel, he said, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. So he knew that, socially speaking, it wasn't his place to try and lead the nation in this rebellion. It wasn't his job to save the nation, or at least it wasn't his place to do it. He wasn't high enough up on the list. And plus, when they went, they got a bunch of loot. And they got glory because they were the ones who chased them out. And the Ephraimites were left out of that. hey, you went and you freed everybody and you got all this glory and you got all this loot and you didn't even invite us. So they accused him fiercely, it says. And it was really a dangerous situation because they could have started to fight each other. That could have been the start of a civil war or something. But Gideon said to them, verse 2, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim, when you glean grapes where you are, isn't that better than the grape harvest than where I am? God has given into your hands the princes, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you?" And then their anger against him subsided. So they were angry, but he says, hey, what do I have in comparison to you? Or, in other words, don't be upset. Even though you came later, you still got the better prize. You were still able to kill the princes. I didn't get to do that. And then he says this thing about the grapes, and it sounds kind of weird, but I think the contemporary English version, it's kind of I think it's probably a paraphrase, but it puts it better. He says it's just like the grape harvest. The grapes that your tribe doesn't even bother to pick up are better than the ones that we grow on purpose. You guys have so much more glory. Compared to you, I'm nothing. We're all nothing compared to you. And you actually did more. Sure, we routed the army, but you are the ones who captured the princes. That's their heads in your hands. And that was enough to calm them down. There wasn't any more fights. And you might expect, and you might even hope, this is where the story ends, right? Gideon ruled Israel for a whole bunch of time, and then he died, and then they started over. But this is not the end. We're not ready for the next judge. In fact, there's a whole lot more to Gideon's story. Verse 4. "And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, 'Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian.' And the officials of Succoth said, 'Are the hands of these two already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?' So Gideon said, 'Well then, when the Lord has given them into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars.' And from there he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the same as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to them, 'When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower.' So while the Ephraimites were chasing down these other two leaders, Gideon was chasing down these two, Zebah and Zalmunna. And his 300 men, when they were running around, they got exhausted. They were hungry and tired, and they didn't have any, they couldn't just stop and get something to eat. So they came to this town, and they asked them. And they had every reason to think that this town was going to take care of them, right? Because Succoth and Penuel both are in the tribe of Gad. So they're Israelites and brothers, and they're people who are also oppressed by these people, by the Midianites. But they refused to help them. They said, "Hey, do you have their hands in your hand already? You know, have you got the victory? I don't think that you've won this yet." And in all fairness, you can't really blame them, can you? Because here you've got these 300 men chasing after 15,000 men. And these 15,000 men have probably already made it close enough to home that they can put their backs to home and fight Gideon and put him off. And then what's going to happen? If they find out, if the Midianites find out that these two towns helped with the rebellion, then what's going to happen to them? So they were terrified, and they said, "No, until it's over, we're not going to be able to help you." But Gideon didn't see it that way. He didn't have much patience for this. And to him, it was treachery. And so he made a promise to return. And he says, "When I return, I'm going to teach you a lesson. The men of Succoth would be flailed with thorns." Now, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? I mean, you know, it's not something I want to have happen, but I'll probably live through that. But I think it's, in my imagination, I pictured like them cutting a bunch of vines with thorns on them, maybe wrapping them together and hitting them with them or something. But that's not what it is to be flailed with thorns. No one is actually exactly sure what it is, but probably Think about the thorns that they used on Jesus when they made that crown. Okay? These weren't just little thorns that scratch. These were those big ones that don't break and they tear your flesh. That's what the Hebrew word there for flail, that's what it means, to tear your flesh. Probably what they're going to do is drag those people through those thorn bushes and let it just cut them to pieces. The other thing that it could be, and this is something that they did, there's a tool called a threshing sledge. All it is some heavy boards with a bunch of sharp rocks or thorns put in it, and it kind of works like a cheese grater. And that's make you lie down, and I'm going to run that thing over you until you die from it. What he was promising to do to them was very serious, and it was torturous. It was painful. Whatever it was, it probably killed them. And then the people of Penuel weren't going to get off much better. It sounds like it. He says, I'm going to tear your tower down. Which that sounds kind of, okay, yeah, tear the tower down, whatever. But for them, that wasn't just something you could just rebuild. That was a very serious thing. Because where do you go when the enemy attacks? He says, oh, you're afraid of being attacked, huh? Well, I tell you what, I'm going to tear down your only place of safety that you have, and then I'm going to be the one who attacks you. And when he does, we're going to see that when he comes back, he not only tears the tower down, but he also kills the men of the city. So this thing is devastating, and Penuel, because they lost their tower and their men, are going to be left doubly helpless. So, he couldn't get any help from them, so he just leaves and he goes off to fight. Verse 10. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkur with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the army of the people of the east, because 120,000 men had fallen who drew the sword. So they went from 135,000 to 15,000. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers and attacked the army because they felt secure. Verse 12. And the two leaders fled, and he pursued them and captured them. And he threw all the army into a panic. So what remained of, this is, again, if you'll look at that map that I sent, this will help this kind of make more sense. What remained of the Midianite army escaped, and they'd crossed the Jordan, and they were going east because they were from the east, so they were trying to get back home. And Gideon, instead of just chasing them, he actually kind of stayed north of them, and they kind of took a straight south angle before they started heading east. Well, he just kept heading southeast and actually went further east than them. And so, if they're looking for him, say I'm running this way. Well, I'm going to keep my eye over here because I know that's where you're coming from. And all of them were watching this way. Well, he had gone back behind them and flanked them. And so when he comes up behind them, they have no idea. They felt secure because he's not coming. They never did see him until it was too late. And then when he attacked, it threw them into another panic. And this time they were totally defeated. Not just 120,000, but all of them died this time. And the two leaders were captured. Verse 13. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, so he's killed all of the Midianites and he's got these two prisoners in tow. The two men that those two towns were so afraid of. He returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, the town, and he captured a young man of Succoth. That's the first town that refused to help him. And he questioned him. And he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to those men, and he said, Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me. That tells you more about how he felt about what they said to him originally. The two men about whom you taunted me, saying, Are they already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So the next order of business was to return back to those two places and keep his word. He found this young man. Who knows how he found him? Maybe he was taking a walk. He captured him and he says, I want to know who's in charge. Write it down. And so that guy goes to work and he gives him 77 names. So when Gideon goes into the town, he marches in and he's got these two prisoners with him. And he says, Hey, you remember teasing me about these guys? You remember when you wouldn't help me because you didn't believe that we could do this? Well, here they are. And by the way, I know who you are. So when I say your name, you better come out. And he starts reading the names. And the leaders have no choice. If they don't come out, the people are going to hand them over. You can imagine their terror when they realized they'd picked the wrong side. And when they realized that he intended on keeping that promise, the way they were going to die or at least be tortured was terrible. So he flailed them with thorns, and then he goes to the next city and he does the same thing. He tears down their tower and he killed all the men. It's hard to know what God thought about that. It's kind of hard for us to hear, though, isn't it? This is as violent as anything on TV. This is brutal and bloody and vicious. What did God think about it? Well, it doesn't say, but it does seem that Gideon thought it was deserved. This was justice in his eyes. And those people had this coming. So when he finished with that, and I can picture, I don't know if he did it right there or not, but I can picture him saying, all right, we're going to this city, and then he deals with them, and he says, now come up here, and he deals with them, and then when that's over, he turns around, he looks at the two guys standing there in chains, and he says, now, it's time to deal with you. He said, verse 18, to Zeba and Zalmunna, where are the men whom you killed at Tabor? And they answered, as you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king. And he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you. With the battle finished, so now that there's no one left except these two guys, he focuses on something that's real personal. This is a real personal issue here. There's no other record of what happened at Tabor. You're not going to look through the Bible and find, and then these brothers of Gideon's died there. Everything we know comes right here from this passage. And it's not much, but it is enough to let us know that these two men killed a whole bunch of people. And some of them were Gideon's brothers. And it reads like, it wasn't just like the heat of battle, they were fighting and some of his brothers were cut down. The way it reads is that either the battle was over and these men were executed, or it was just a slaughter and never was a battle to begin with. They know, hey, there are some people over here who are a threat to us. Let's go kill them. And he knows that these men are the ones who are responsible for it. So he brings up the question. He says, where are the men you killed? Or other translations say, what kind of men did you kill? Because the answer that they give doesn't really match with where are they. But that is not really the point. The better translation is, where are they? Where are the men whom you killed? And what he's really getting at is, what about those men? Let's talk about those men whom you killed. Why'd you do it? Where are they now? And their reply was that they were men who were just like Gideon. They were men, they say, as you are, so were they. What does that mean? Well, Gideon, I know you're angry that we've killed these men, but they were just like you. They were kings. In other words, they were a threat to us. They were the kind of people who could raise up an army and start a rebellion. We had no choice, is what they're saying. He says, what about the men? Where are they? Hey, we had no choice. We had to do that. They were a threat to us. So, verse 20, Gideon said to Jether, his firstborn, rise and kill them. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Then Zeba and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and fall upon us. For as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and killed them, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. So, this is like I said earlier, it's a tough story to read, but we shouldn't try to put our own morals on it. A lot of people who read this, say, well, Gideon was doing a personal thing. It was a vendetta, and it was vengeance, and God doesn't want vengeance and all this. But we shouldn't try to put our morals on this story, and we have to see it within the broader context of what it is. These two guys were not victims at all. Okay? Don't forget that. What Gideon is doing, he's fighting against, in Psalm 83, don't turn there, but in Psalm 83:10, there's this long list, we're going to read it at the end, of people who came against God's people. And these two are mentioned in part of that. And it says about them, they said, let us take possession for ourselves of the pastures of God. So they went in with the intention of taking the land from Israel. They were oppressors, murderers, raiders. They were thieves. They weren't good people. And because of them, the Israelites had to live in the caves. So Gideon didn't do anything beyond what was in the law. He came as Israel's savior. And these people were people who had persecuted God's people. And so it was his job to kill them. And what he did, he had a right by law. You know the what's he called? The blood avenger. He had a right by law to kill the people who had murdered his brothers. And he even said, if you hadn't killed them, if you'd saved them alive, I wouldn't kill you now. But now I have to. Not only are you a threat to our security, but you are also, you're standing here in front of me as the murderers of my brothers. And so I have no choice. And he has to kill them. And so he tells his son, he wants to give him the honor. He says, all right, you do it. And by doing that, he's going to honor his son, but he's also going to humiliate the two men. They didn't die in battle. They didn't die from some great warrior. They died from some kid who was learning how to do it. But the kid couldn't do it. He just didn't have it in him. And so Gideon himself, he says, all right then. Actually what they say is actually kind of a inspiring way to go out. They say, hey, if you're such a man, then you do it. And he says, all right, I am such a man. So he draws out his sword and he hacks him down. Then, verse 22, now that the whole battle's over, and everything is finished, the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also. For you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and neither will my son. The Lord, Yahweh, will rule over you. So when the last Midianite fell, when it was all over, the Israelites realized that it was time to govern themselves again. And you would think that Yahweh would be enough, but they wanted a king. They needed a king. And we're going to read in other places, we want a king like the nations. We need someone that we can see who we're going to follow. And we need something consistent, not like these judges who come and go. We need a dynasty. We need someone who could really rule over us and tell us what we're supposed to do and fight for us and all this. And it might not sound that bad, but if you think about what happened later, you remember Samuel, he was the last judge, right before they were given a king, King Saul. Well, the Israelites told him, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. We're tired of these judges, give us a king. And that way we can be like everybody around us. And Samuel didn't want to do it. And he said, no, I'm not going to do this. And he goes and he tells God, he says, God, they're asking for a king. They say judges aren't enough. They say you're not enough. And God says, hey, look, don't take it personally. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. It's me that they don't want. Actually, what it says, this is 1 Samuel 8:7. They have rejected me from being king over them. They don't want me to be their ruler. So Samuel goes back out and he tries to warn them. God said, let them have it. And he said, okay. So he goes out and he says, look, y'all don't want this. He's going to do all kinds of stuff that you're not going to like. He's going to take and take and take and take, and your lives aren't going to be good. But they said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Isn't that sad? That's depressing that these people, that God did this. I got your army down to 300. And I defeated all your enemy and drove them out. And before you can do anything else, they don't worship, they don't thank God. They go straight away to saying, well, he's not really that good of a king. Let's make Gideon our king. Let's do something better. Let's have someone we can see. Let's have someone our enemies can see. Obviously, the Midianites aren't afraid of our God. but they are afraid of Yahweh. Let's put him in charge. Or they're not afraid of Yahweh, but they are afraid of Gideon. So let's put him in charge. Well, there wasn't time for that, though. And Gideon wasn't going to have it. He says, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to be your king, and my son isn't going to be your king. Yahweh is your king, and that's who you're going to serve. So just forget about it. The Lord will rule over you. And here we are once again. We'd like to see the end of the story, right? Please just end the story here. Do well. But it's not over. We still got a little bit to go. Verse 24. And Gideon said to them, so, we want you to be king. No, but I tell you what I will do. Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. The Midianites were not necessarily from Ishmael. They were travelers like Ishmael. They were nomads. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Now, don't get confused here and think that this ephod was an idol. It wasn't like, at the beginning he tore down Baal's altar and the Asherah pole. That's not what the ephod was, not even close. An ephod was a breastplate. You remember when God was given the law? He told Moses, this is how the priests have to dress. Remember, we went all through all this. One of the things that he had to wear was called an ephod. It was like a breastplate. So he had his cloak, but then he also had this thing that he put on, and it had 12 stones in it, one for each of the tribes. And he also kept the Urim and the Thummim there, and it was an oracle. So they said, well, kind of like casting lots, well, what does God say about this? Well, let's draw this out, this card or whatever, and this is going to tell us yes or no. Well, God gave that to them in the law. He gave the priest an ephod to wear. So when Gideon wanted people to serve God, they said, hey, be our king. He said, no, you're going to serve God, and here's what I'm going to do. You give me all the earrings. Okay? And when they did, that 1,700 shekels, it's somewhere between 40 and 75 pounds of gold. They put it all in this big cloak. And he says, all right, I'm going to melt it down, and I'm going to make an ephod like the one that the priest wears. It was supposed to be a religious thing. It was supposed to be a symbol that helps Israel remember that Yahweh is our God. He's the one that we're supposed to be serving. The problem is that the plan backfired, didn't it? The people started looking at that like it had some kind of power. It became a snare. And even though it wasn't an idol, it had the same effect as an idol. All Israel whored themselves after it. They started to look at it like it had some kind of supernatural power. Do you remember this is in 1 Samuel 4, when the Philistines defeated the Israelites? This is during Gideon's time, they had to deal with the Midianites, but then in this time, in Samuel's time, they had to deal with the Philistines. And so they're fighting against them, and they lose the battle. They lost a whole bunch of men, and they say, oh no, what are we going to do? And someone gets the bright idea, and he says, let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. Wait a minute, what were they doing? They said, well, we can't win this battle, but I know what can get it for us, the ark. If we have the ark of the covenant here with us, then we're going to win. Well, isn't that kind of voodoo? That's kind of superstitious, isn't it? You're going to take this wooden box and carry it around with you. It's kind of like, on Indiana Jones, it drives me crazy when I see that, because they think, well, if you have this ark, you've got the power of God with you. And that was the whole reason they were looking for it. But that's just superstition. The Ark of the Covenant was just a box. Granted, it was holy in that it was set apart. It wasn't like all the other boxes. This one had a specific purpose, and people who touched it died because you weren't supposed to touch it. But there was no power in the box. God was the power. Well, that's what happened with this ephod. They're starting to look at this thing like, hey, this thing can save us. If we get this out during a battle, that's how we're going to win. Because Gideon, he's the one who gave it to us. And it represents the priesthood. And it represents the thing that the priest wears for knowing God's will. And so, as long as we've got it with us, then we're going to be just fine. You see that a lot still today, don't you? People have their little saint whatever around their neck. And this guy here, he's going to save me. That's what it was. It was superstition. And instead of drawing the people closer to God, it became a snare. And what began as an attempt to glorify God ended up leading the people away from Him. So, we're going to end here on verse 28. Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. We're going to end there because this next section introduces Abimelech, Gideon's son, and it's a little bit choppy right there, but that's going to take us on into chapter 9, and we're going to see more about him. But what can we learn from Gideon's story? I mean, this chapter, I have not been more entertained by another passage. There's a lot. It's vivid detail. It's violent and gory and bloody, and it's an adventure. But what's the point? I mean, surely the point isn't to entertain us, right? And the point isn't just to give us history. There's got to be something here about Christ. There's got to be something about the gospel. So what is it? Well, it wasn't the easiest to find, but I think if you'll consider these points, I think that you'll agree that these show us how Christ is better and what Christ does. One point that we might make is that one observation we could make and then get to the point is that Gideon couldn't be reasoned with, and he didn't shrink away from delivering judgment. Right? I mean, you read those stories. What did he do? Well, he killed those two guys without remorse. He was going to let his son do it, but his son couldn't. He said, yeah, I can do it. They said, hey, a man's only as strong as his strength. You know, as the man is, so is his strength. Yeah, I've got the strength to do that. I have no problem hacking you up. He went to those two towns, brothers. These were fellow Israelites, and he had no problem at least torturing them, if he didn't kill them, torturing them in a terrible way. What I mean is that he had a real strong sense of justice, whether we agree with it or not, whether it appeals to our morality or not. The fact is that he had a strong sense of justice, and he thought what he was doing was what they deserved, and he didn't mind following through with the consequences. More often than not, how do people see Christ? No problem with him being a great shepherd, right? He's the great shepherd. He's the one who leads us beside the still waters and all this, into the green pastures. But not so much as a great warrior, huh? Is he not a great warrior? Is he not a greater warrior than Gideon? When he judges the world, you won't be able to reason with him. He won't be afraid to follow through. The way Gideon had such a strong sense of justice and was willing to carry through its consequences, Christ is even more so. It makes me think of that verse in Isaiah 42. The Lord goes out like a mighty man. Now, you know, you'll see a lot of signs at a football game, John 3:16 or whatever. They'll put those signs up. I bet they wouldn't put this one up. The Lord goes out like a mighty man. Like a man of war, he stirs up his zeal. He cries out. He shouts aloud. He shows himself mighty against his foes. I mean, the image that we're getting here is a barbarian, a berserker, someone who is not afraid, and someone who is screaming. And that's exactly what Gideon and his men did. A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And they got themselves ready for battle. That's exactly what Christ does. He will show himself mighty against his foes. And so as much as you could say that Gideon was feared, and he was feared for good reason, he was vicious. It is a dreadful thing. It is a much more dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Another point that we might see here is that Gideon's biggest failure was leading people astray despite his good intentions. He wanted to do what was right, but he was wrong. He was supposed to be a man that people could follow. And he thought that what he was doing was a good thing, but he was just a man. And that's the difference between him and Christ. He didn't know truth all the time. And this really ought to be a lesson that we learn even now for ourselves, because we have to be careful who we follow. We're reading this book, and it's hard to make the text come alive, isn't it? It's hard to see Gideon's personality. We get a few hints, but we don't, if he was standing right in front of us, living, and we could hear him talk, we'd probably be inspired by him. He was a fascinating character. And these people were fascinated with him. So fascinated. They said, we want you to be our king. We want your kids. Even before we know how they'll rule, we know that we want your family to rule over us. We believe that you're that kind of guy. And there are people who are still like that for us today. Role models and mentors and people who we believe that we can follow. And that you need those kinds of people. But you have to be very careful. How do you know when your role model is going in the wrong direction? Well, how do we know when Gideon was going in the wrong direction? The law said, make an ephod for the priest. And Gideon said, I can do even better. That should have been the flag. You know more than God. You can do better than God. Yeah, because God's ephod, it wasn't made out of 70 pounds of gold. We have the means to do even more than what God was able to do. That's a problem. You got to stop right there. If God had wanted a 75-pound golden ephod, he would have had us do that. But he didn't. And just because something seems okay doesn't mean that it is, because this thing was actually a graven image. This was something that he put in front of them with the best intentions, but it caused them to go astray. It had the same effect as if it had been an idol. But Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Christ is the door. He's the gate. If you want to get to the Father, that was the point of that whole thing, is that this is how we're going to approach God. We got to go to the temple to do it, or the tabernacle to do it, but this year is going to be something that helps us. No, Christ is it. And he never leads us astray. If you only go through him, you have no problem. But if you go away from him, you have got idolatry, you have got heresy, you have got miserable failure. And the thing about it is, they hoard themselves out to it, and it became a snare. But I think the main point, this is the last one I'm going to say, I think the main point of this passage, and the one that's easiest to see, is that Gideon chased down the enemies until the last one was dead. If you get nothing else out of this, this is what I see, is Gideon's army had a hard time finishing this battle, but they kept going until it was over. How much more does Christ do? And how much further does he go? The last enemy is death, and he will not stop until the last one is gone. I told you I wanted to go back and read that psalm, Psalm 83, because it takes from this story and several others, and it sets up what I think is a parallel to maybe what we read in Revelation. It parallels our hope in the new covenant. What is God going to do for us? Well, just like with Gideon, he's not going to be reasoned with when it comes to the wicked. When it comes to justice, he will follow through. Following him, you can't go wrong. But going against him, you can't go right. He will defeat every enemy until they're all gone. Psalm 83. O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold your peace or be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have raised their heads. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they conspire with one accord. Against you they make a covenant. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre, Ashur also has joined them. They are the strong arm of the children of Lot. Do to them as you did to Midian, as to Sisera and Jabin at the river of Kishon. That was Deborah and Barak, who were destroyed at Endor, who became dung for the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb. That was the two that the Ephraimites took. All their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna. That's the ones that Gideon took. Who said, let us take possession for ourselves of the pastures of God. O my God, make them like whirling dust, like chaff before the wind. As fire consumes the forest, as the flame sets the mountain ablaze. Are you seeing all the violence in this? It's poetic, but what are they asking God to do? So may you pursue them with your tempest and terrify them with your hurricane. Fill their faces with shame that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be put to shame and dismayed forever. Let them perish in disgrace, that they may know that you alone, whose name is the Lord, are the most high over all the earth. Jesus, this is our prayer for our spiritual war. Do not keep your silence. Do not hold your peace or be still. Instead, make them like whirling dust and chaff before the wind. Consume them like a forest fire. Pursue them with your tempest and terrify them. Fill them with shame. Let Satan perish in disgrace, and you be glorified. All our trust is in you. In Jesus' name, amen.